Okay, well, welcome to the second in our discussion of the subject of growth and the specifically the subject of the growth paradox, which we're covering over a series of weeks in a series of different discussions. The overarching idea and the subject of our discussions is the strange fact that while growth is so important to companies, probably the single most important attribute that any company can have, it's often about the least well managed area of most companies' businesses, and this is hence the title, The Growth Paradox. And in this series of discussions, we're trying to investigate that to understand why it is that this paradox exists. As the discussions go on, we'll start to explore some of the more recent understandings that are emerging of how consumers operate and how they make choices and how they decide which brands to buy, how a lack of understanding of those areas is causing problems and lack of performance for a lot of companies, and some of the new opportunities that are opening up as a consequence of that for companies who are alive to them. I'm hosting these discussions, and just a little bit of background on me. So my name is Andy Brent, and I've spent all of my life really working on growth challenges of one sort or another. I've worked in the UK and in Europe and in Asia, in global roles and regional roles. And I've worked for some big companies, the likes of Procter & Gamble and Hutchison Whampoa in Asia, people like Boots and Sky and Barclays in the UK. And I've worked for small companies, startups, and in the private and the public sector. So all of those different areas have been to do with trying to help companies to grow. And I'm now co-founder of a growth consultancy called Bloom Group Consulting. So growth is, if anything, is my specialist subject. Growth is probably it. So hence my hosting these discussions. The subjects that we're going to cover in the course of these discussions start with the growth paradox itself, and the first of these talks was on that subject. And for each of these discussions, I will be joined by senior leaders from around the business world. For the first of those discussions on the growth paradox, I was joined by Kieran Hannon, the CMO of an American tech company called Belkin International, and we explored that in some detail. And we'll now take that subject on, and starting today by talking about a big growth mistake that many companies make. In subsequent weeks, we'll go on to talk about the brain science behind growth, how our brains operate, how we're wired to make decisions and choose between brands in certain ways, and how little a lot of that is understood in the business world. We'll talk about targeting and segmentation, and how companies often misunderstand where their biggest growth opportunities are. We'll talk about positioning and how companies can become better at understanding how to position themselves to maximize their chances of growth. And then we'll sort of wrap all that together into challenging some of the common assumptions about business strategy and marketing strategy and executions, and those are the subjects that we'll cover. For each of those discussions, I'll be joined by senior leaders from around the business world. And today, to talk about the big growth mistake, I'm joined by Phil Anderton, who's an old friend and colleague of mine. We started together many years ago at Procter & Gamble, and Phil is co-founder with me of the growth consultancy business that we're both working on. So let me welcome Phil and just hand over to him to give you a bit of his background.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Andy. My background, as Andy said, I started my career at Procter & Gamble, and then I moved on to the Coca-Cola company, working in the UK and then globally in Atlanta and in Vienna for Central Europe. And then I moved out of the fast-moving consumer goods world and moved into sports marketing, commercial side of sports, and general management. And I worked as CEO at Scottish Rugby. Then I moved into football with a Scottish Premier League football team, Heart of Midlothian. And then moved into tennis, where I was Chief Marketing Officer and Chairman of the ATP World Tour Finals that you probably would have seen Murray winning on Sunday. And now, as Andy says, I'm co-founder and partner at Bloom Group a growth consultancy, focusing on one thing, growth, and helping companies to grow.
Yeah, cool. So between us, we've sort of worked in many different sectors and different types of businesses. So the subject we're going to turn to today is what we call the big growth mistake. It's a fundamental misunderstanding that many companies make. Probably all of the companies that Phil and I have been associated with make an erroneous assumption about how we go about making decisions and choosing between brands. We're going to explore that mistake. We're also going to get into some of the insights and the truths that companies tend to miss. And finally, we're going to get into uncovering what's probably a bit of a secret about what you need to do if you want to set yourself up to grow. So we'll cover each of those in a little bit of detail. We start with the big growth mistake itself. We would postulate that the big growth mistake, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how all of us go about choosing which brands to buy, choosing between brands. And it's an assumption that lies behind the thinking that many companies bring to their commercial planning. And the big mistake that we think companies make is this. The working assumption that seems to be common is that in any category, whichever category you happen to be in, on any given day, pretty much all of the purchases that are being made out there are potentially up for grabs. And growth will come by grabbing more of those purchases than your competitors do. If you do that better than your competitors, they grow. If your competitors do it better than you, then they'll be the ones to grow. And what we say is that's a mistaken assumption. That's not how consumers operate. Those opportunities are not all there for all businesses. And that mistake causes commercial plans to be put together that are often expensive, inefficient, and wasteful, and rarely lead to growth. So let me start by putting that broad assertion out there that this is a mistake that many companies make, and throw it all over to Phil. You know, we could say on the one hand that doesn't sound like such a big mistake. The assumption that the purchases are out there to be grabbed, and if you grab more of them, you'll do better, you'll grow more. What's wrong with that as an assumption, and what bad consequences flow from it?
Well, the number one reason that I would say it's an unreasonable, working hypothesis that all purchases are up for grabs is that it just simply doesn't work. You know, the data that's out there shows that most companies, best data that we've seen is 9 out of 10 companies actually fail to grow their business, both top and bottom line, sustainably year after year. And the idea that sort of one brand can satisfy all the emotional and functional goals that consumer have is fanciful. And of course, the consequences of taking that type of approach where you're trying to go after all of the purchases within a category is it's extremely expensive. Complicated marketing and commercial plans, trying to reach out to all of these consumers for all the different occasions, all the different purchases, just costs a lot of money to deliver. And the third reason is because consumers don't shop this way and are not open to brands and companies trying to get them to buy their brand for all the occasions, it means they have to resort to ineffective promotion, typically sort of price promotions, but also to hit their bottom line. If none of that's working, they have to get into cost cutting. And of course, as you know, cost cutting is a route to lack of growth and lack of profitability. So it doesn't work. It's not a sensible thing to do. It's super expensive to run. And you resort to short-term tactics to hit bottom lines.
And yet, you know, we've both been in many companies when you see this going on all the time. You see companies running commercial plans that are constantly promoting, that are spending lots of money on ever-changing advertising campaigns, are driving initiatives into the market. It seems that most companies just can't resist this. Why is that? What are the pressures that cause companies almost to get this short-term madness that drives them into this behavior?
I think there are a number of key reasons for that, Andy, and I think the first one's a strange one. I think it's just stuff. Stuff comes along for companies, especially as they grow and become bigger. CEOs of every day, their diaries are full with everything to do from HR to what's the latest IT strategy, to what's the latest infrastructure project, what's the latest crisis that's happening, shareholders, etc., etc. Stuff gets in the way, and they forget about the core fundamentals about what probably made them grow in the first place. The second key reason, I think, is external pressures. What are the competition doing? If the competition is doing something that looks like it's going to be successful and going to take share from your business, it's very easy for companies to be distracted and start moving in and trying to replicate or copy what the competition are doing. The third reason, I think, is a real lack of consumer understanding about why consumers buy what they buy, for what purpose, and when they're buying it. No doubt we'll come on and talk about that in a little more detail. And the fourth issue is frankly a symptom of businesses, certainly in the West, where there is so much pressure on the short term, where you have CEOs and marketing directors on remuneration and bonus systems that puts how are we doing for this fiscal year as the most important thing that they can do. So when you ask a marketing director about what are your long-term plans, well, that's interesting, but the thing that's really important for them is I've got to hit my numbers by the end of this year. And so what does that then drive you to? Short-term tactics of price promotion and cost cutting, etc., that basically takes you away from the core fundamentals about why do people buy you in the first place.
So yeah, I mean, look, that makes a lot of sense. You almost say it's not that people are badly intentioned, it's just that all of those pressures that are there are pushing even the best intentioned CEOs, CMOs away from the longer term stuff into saying we've got to hit the numbers, we've got to beat the competitors, we've got to come up with a new idea, and that pushes
that's exactly right.
away from doing the right things. To bring that
exactly.
alive, any examples you can give of companies you've seen or you've worked with that have suffered from that mistake and have pushed a lot of essentially wasteful money into short-term activity?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is just look at the 9 out of 10 companies that are failing to grow year in, year out. Look down any supermarket aisle and you'll see a whole host of brands trying to grab all those purchases, resorting to price discounting to try and hit those growth numbers. So 9 out of 10 is a pretty good example. But an example of a brand, biggest brand in the world, that for a period of time in the 80s was struggling to grow and was making the big growth mistake, and that was Coca-Cola, the Coca-Cola brand. They had been obviously growing for generations, but Pepsi was beginning to outflank them, and Pepsi was chosen by a lot of consumers because it was choice of a new generation, but also because they said it had a better tasting product. So the Coca-Cola company got distracted by that competitive pressure and said, we need to do something about our taste profile, which in taste tests was inferior to Pepsi. So they threw away all of the brand equity they had about being the original cola, being about constancy, being about authentic, and moved to a new product with a supposedly better tasting product. And as a result of that, their volume tanked, and within a couple of months they had to resort back to what their real equity was, which is all about the emotional connection, enjoyment with friends and family. So I think that's even the biggest brands can make the mistake of thinking that every purchase is out there as long as you can come up with a new initiative and a new marketing campaign to try and reach those purchases when they're simply not available.
I mean, that's a great example, and it sort of makes you think, if even Coke, with all of the strength of that brand and all of the wisdom inside that company, can get driven down that path, how hard is it for any company to resist? So if that's the mistake, then, if that's a common mistake that it seems most companies, even the biggest, even the best, get driven into, what do they miss? What are the insights and the truths about the way that consumers really go about shopping and choosing between brands that companies miss, and which, if they understood, would enable them to be much more effective in the way they deploy their resources and deliver growth?
Well, I think the biggest mistake that companies make is thinking that consumers are buying very logically and that they stand in front of the shopping aisle, or if they're getting a service, that they stand and logically evaluate every option, one versus the other. Consumers, human beings, we simply don't act that way. And there's a lot of great science that now understands how our brains actually do work. And our brains are working away in the background to basically make our lives a lot simpler. And so when it comes to shopping and buying, what we do to make our lives simpler is our brain buys on autopilot. And it's all happening subconsciously. We're not logically thinking about every decision that we're trying to make. And what happens is, because of consumers' experiences with brands over time, the consumer will pick a small number of favorite brands with whom they will have generated a strong emotional bond. And then literally every time that they go and use that product or service, they are buying on autopilot. They're not thinking out loud, what am I going to buy? What am I going to use this time around? They're simply choosing it because it's born out of habit to keep everything as simple as possible. And back to the point you made earlier about, are all purchases up for grabs? Well, they're clearly not, because the consumer screens out all other brands who are desperately shouting to try and get the purchase that the consumer has already made because they're buying on autopilot. So I guess that's the big secret, is that consumers are buying emotionally because of emotional goals that they're trying to reach, and they're buying those brands on autopilot.
And you're really saying that is behavior that is hardwired into us to cope with all the complexity that we have to deal with in our lives, not just in shopping areas, but everywhere, right? Do you think we use that behavior to cope beyond shopping?
Well, definitely. I mean, an example that we often think about is our television viewing habits. I mean, just think about nowadays the number of television channels that we have available to us. I think I've probably got about 800 channels that I could choose from. But do I sit at home with my channel changer and evaluate logically every option that's out there? No, I don't. I choose on autopilot. And I've subconsciously decided that I have 3 or 4 channels that I will continue to buy, probably accounting for about 75% of my viewing habits. So Sky Sports, BBC One, Discovery Channel, that's probably it. And yet, how simple would it be for me to look at all those different alternatives? There is no cost and hardly any physical activity required to have a repertoire of 150 television channels, and yet I choose not to do it. And that, for me, is a great example of autopilot behavior happening for real every day.
Yeah, that's a great example. And so, bringing it to brands, then, if the secret is to become one of those autopilot brands, to get yourself on the default list for some subgroup of consumers, give us some examples of brands that have done that well, and that you might say, this brand became autopilot and grew really, really strongly. What's a couple of examples of that?
I think there's probably 2 really powerful examples. The first one is, it's the category of antiperspirant deodorant, obviously a massive market. Hopefully everyone's using them. Dominated historically by brands like Sure and Right Guard. And they became big and successful because for a large number of consumers, the emotional goal that they were seeking to satisfy is staying in control. And those brands were able to deliver or satisfy against that emotional need because they were effectively formulated and prevented, perspiration and wet stains, et cetera, et cetera. But for another very important group of consumers, the emotional goal of staying in control is completely irrelevant. What that group of consumers is looking for is excitement. And that group is young men. And young men, when they use, or sadly in the past didn't use, but if they are going to use an antiperspirant deodorant, the goal that they're trying to satisfy is a brand that will help them, give them the confidence to have the excitement of being able to, be attractive, frankly, to girls. And so Lynx really understood that, came up with a proposition, and then brought that to life with, masculine packages, masculine fragrances, brilliant activation. And I understand that they got almost half of the market share of the male antiperspirant deodorant market. And that's in a market that was extremely well developed, and shows that there are opportunities if you can link your brand to the key emotional drivers for a particular group of consumers. Yeah. So that'd be the first example. Do you want the second example? Would be, I think it was the late 80s. Premier Inn came along, where all those budget hotels were really kind of positioning themselves on price and location. We're in the middle of town and we're cheaper than the next one. And they realized that actually for a group of consumers, busy travelers, the key emotion that they were trying to satisfy when they stay at a budget hotel is actually around feeling energized, feeling alive when you wake up in the morning and you've got a full day of meetings to go to. So they understood that emotion, and therefore developed a proposition that was all about delivering a fantastic night's sleep. And obviously that was brought to life through the purchase of quality beds and pillows and a good night's sleep guarantee. And now I understand that Premier Inn's about 75% of Whitbread's profitability, and a great example of a brand that has matched what its offering is to the emotional goals of a core group of consumers. So I'd say those are probably the best two examples that I could give you, Andy.
Perfect examples. And so both of those drove big growth, both in very competitive markets, both from positions where they weren't particularly strong before they attained that autopilot status and grew significantly. But what then is the advantage of that? I mean, those are two great examples, but obviously to get to that place takes some time and some effort and some understanding, not that easy. Why is that a better way to go than the more common, let's just try to grab as many purchases as we can and grow as much as we can? Commercially, why does that route benefit companies?
Well, the alternative approach that a lot of companies make, as we said, is to go after all the purchases. As we know, we don't shop that way. We shop on autopilot. So those attempts to sort of shout out to buy me are being screened out by the consumer's brains, because you're not on autopilot. You're not delivering in that particular area because other brands have owned that particular space in the marketplace. So if, on the other side, if you take this approach of becoming an autopilot brand, what you'll find is if you've matched your brand's benefits to the emotional goals of a particular group of consumers, you will get them to buy you on autopilot, which means they'll be more loyal to your brand. They'll also become advocates of your brand and become your marketeers, if you like. And they'll also be buying you from full price. You don't need to bribe them with discounts that, by the way, only work in the short term if you're not an autopilot brand. And obviously, if you're selling on full price and you've got loyal fans who are advocating you, you are going to grow and you're going to be more profitable. So some real commercial benefits for this type of approach to growth.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so that feels very persuasive, that's a much better way to go about growing than randomly just trying to grab as many purchases as you can. A couple of great examples of companies that have managed to attain that status, and you've talked a bit about how they've done that. But what's the secret? Most brands are not autopilot brands, a few are. What's the secret? How do you get to become an autopilot brand?
Well, it's by developing a really strong proposition that links up the equity that you have in the brand with the emotional goals that the certain group of consumers are trying to satisfy at one particular part of the usage within that category. But it's not sufficient just to come up with a strong proposition. The really powerful propositions start first and foremost with what we would call the moment of maximum emotional impact. And what that is that moment when the use of a product or service is most important, where the success or failure of that product or service is most important. And It's at those particular moments when consumers are making the decision to either keep you as their autopilot brand or move on to another brand who is actually delivering better at that moment of maximum emotional impact. So really understanding that moment is what engages your consumer in the first place. If you can then subsequently offer powerful benefits, that's what's going to attract them and persuade them to go out and buy you on autopilot. So getting that moment is absolutely vital.
Okay, so there are key moments where the emotional importance of how the product does is particularly important, and if you can own those moments, then the chances are you'll become an autopilot choice. If I go back to the two products that you talked about, two brands you talked about earlier, so Lynx and Premier Inns, talk us through the moments. What are the moments that they managed to own, and how did they do that?
Well, the moment for Lynx is when a young male is meeting a girl, perhaps for the first time, and the moment is knowing that boys feel nervous in that situation, and what they require is the confidence to feel that they're attractive to the girl. So if you can understand that moment, you can then build a proposition that says Lynx is the brand that gives you that confidence because we've got a range of masculine fragrances that are attractive to girls. So understanding that moment of attraction was vital for them. The Premier Inn example, the moment is not the obvious one around I want a hotel that's nearby the train station, or I want a great bar, or I want lots of towels, or I want lots of shampoos and all the rest of it. And not the price either. The key moment is when you wake up and you've got that full day ahead of you, and you need to feel refreshed, revitalized, and ready to go for the day ahead. Once you understand that moment, you can then give them the promise of a great night's sleep, and you can convince people because you've invested in great quality mattresses and pillows, etc.
Yeah, I mean that brings it to life really, really well. Lynx is interesting. As you know, I've got two boys who are just past that teenage stage now, but I can remember when they were at that age, they were really not interested in the benefits of deodorants at all, except in the environment where they thought they might be meeting girls. And then they're super, and you could have tried to sell them on the benefits of dryness or triple lock or long lasting. They wouldn't have cared. But get them on that one moment, which Lynx did brilliantly well, and they were both massive Lynx consumers. So it makes the point really well. So yeah. Why is it so difficult then? So that you've given us a couple of examples of companies that have done this well, yet the stats you quoted earlier, that only 10% of companies do grow successfully and profitably. Why is it so difficult? Why do so many companies get it wrong or miss these moments?
I think the first reason is back to what we talked about earlier, the growth mistake, that companies are just too busy, caught up with stuff, trying to run after every purchase, and not spending the time and the hard yards really understanding, what are the key emotions for which consumers, what's the key moment within that. And the second reason is even those companies that do take the time to understand their consumers and why they're buying, they use conventional research, focus groups, surveys. It's a probably multi-million, if not billion industry. And yet we've had experience, Andy, where we've spent fortunes at companies like Procter & Gamble and the Coca-Cola Company. And yet the reality of the in-market performance compared to what the research told you could happen is very disappointing. And the reason conventional research doesn't work is because conventional research taps into the conscious, very logical part of our brains. And consumers will tell you why they buy what they buy, but it's actually misleading. They're not lying to you. It's just that you're not really getting to the part of the brain that is making the decisions, which is the subconscious. So conventional research is very good for understanding what people do, but it's just not very good at telling you why people do what they do, why they purchase what they purchase, etc. So, you've got to find alternative ways of reaching the subconscious, and I'm sure that's something you're going to be discussing in one of the other series.
We will, and I mean, when you say that, it takes you back to remembering what a rational place companies are. It's very hard to get corporate environments to think about emotional things or subconscious things. For all of us who've worked in big companies, you've got to prove every proposition you make. You've got to bring data. It's got to be logical. So it pushes us, doesn't it, into using very rational approaches to understanding consumers. And what you're saying is that misses this big emotional component, which is probably more important for a lot of decision making than rational. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And there are techniques in conventional research which dig into what are the emotional reasons why you buy what you buy. But the key point with conventional research is, and it's been kind of proven by PhD scientists who understand the workings of the brain, that conventional research, the way that the questions are asked, it engages the logical, only 5% actually, part of the brain that consumers give responses back. So you'll be told things that they believe genuinely are the emotional as well as the functional reasons why they buy brands. The worrying thing for companies' perspectives is oftentimes it's misleading, and it can take you down a path of developing propositions and multi-million-pound activation budgets behind those propositions that will take you down a dead end. So, it really is an exciting new chapter in growth, that there are now techniques that really do get to the predominantly emotional drivers of why people buy what they buy, and why or how they associate certain brands with certain emotions. And then the skill is being able to identify areas where there's an opportunity and match up your brand with that opportunity, which I'm sure you're going to be talking about in further episodes of this series.
For sure. And I guess the implication of that is, while those different ways of going about understanding consumers exist, not many companies are using them yet.
Yeah, I mean, the work that's been done, there's been some, preeminent scientists who won Nobel Prizes for working on this type of stuff. Has only really come in the last 15 to 20 years. And you know what? It's probably back to that same symptom as before. Companies working short-term timescales, very risk-averse, needing to hit the bottom line, lots of stuff going on, lots of staying in comfort zones. This is the way we've always done things. And so perhaps they look at the new ways of accessing consumer insights as being a bit too far out on the margin. But I would certainly advise that companies stop using conventional research if you're trying to get to the why. Stop using short-term promotional pricing activity and cost cutting to hit your top line and bottom line. And thirdly, start investing in techniques that really understand the real emotional drivers of why people buy what they buy. And if you do that, you'll be setting yourself on path to start growing significantly.
Perfect, yeah. Great, that's fantastic. That really, that opens up a lot of really important areas, and some we will explore later on. But if I sort of summarize some of the stuff we've covered then, so, we started with the big growth mistake, the mistaken assumption that the way to grow is to grab as many of those purchases that are out there every day as you can, and how that drives companies into very tactical short-term activity, which is often expensive and complex and doesn't work very well. We talked about the truth about how we are all hardwired to buy on autopilot from a small group of favorite brands, and how those brands are chosen emotionally and subconsciously. And we also talked about how those choices are made at these key moments of maximum emotional impact, where the emotional implication of a product doing a good job or a bad job is particularly strong, and the examples that you gave of Lynx and Premier Inn's are great examples of that. And then finally touched on this huge sort of hole, which is that, you know, that most of business is using conventional research techniques, which are great at connecting rationally and finding out what people do, but they're really bad at understanding why they do it. And as yet, the business world hasn't really discovered that new techniques exist that can do both of those things. So that probably summarizes some of the issues. Does that make sense? Is there anything else I've missed or you'd want to add for today's discussion?
No, I think you've summarized it perfectly, Andy. So hopefully, you know, people listening to this and the other episodes in your series will not be making the big growth mistake in future. Now they know the secret to growth, and will be investing, or certainly looking into the new techniques that can help companies to get their growth really accelerating.
All right, mate. Thank you very much indeed. Great discussion. Really appreciate it. And that tees up some great subjects for us to go on to talk about in this series. Thanks a lot, Phil.
Thanks very much, Andy.